Welcome to the Action Network podcast presented by BetMGM. We've reached the last major of the season as Royal Troon Golf Club hosts the 152nd Open with the Claret Jug on the line. I'll be caddying for our featured pairing today. That, of course, means our golf expert, Spencer Aguiar, co-host of Action Network's golf betting podcast, Links and Locks, is here, as well as Pat Mayo of the Pat Mayo Experience. After guiding us through the field at the U.S. Open last month, you were back by popular demand. And on today's program, we're going to do our best to try to keep it in the fairway for you, the audience, starting with how to handle the top of the board, looking at the course conditions, shorter odds worth backing, as well as the head-to-head market and our favorite long shots. Now, this will be Royal Troon's 10th British Open, with most scores falling in between 10 to 13 under in the range for the winner. But in 2016, conditions were ideal, and Hendrik Stenson took advantage. He won the tournament at 20 under par with a blistering 63 on that final Sunday. So let's start there, Spencer. What are the conditions looking like this week, and how does that impact your handicap?
I think the caution that I would express to everyone that is diving into Royal Troon this year is that the course has experienced some minor changes from the last time we saw this in action in 2016. 9 holes have received brand new tee boxes. That's added over 200 yards to the property. To me, that distance is really noteworthy since you get this thick rough and these fairway bunkers that are one of the course's best defenses against the bomb and gouge mentality that often comes into play with modern technology. Players are going to experience a true one-stroke penalty for wayward drives off the tee. That includes gorse bushes that can come into play if you miss to the wrong angle. That's going to all highlight the importance of finding the short grass when you do have a driver in hand. But when you get to the second shot nature of the course, it's not as if the fairway lie is always going to be perfect either. Undulation comes into play to accentuate what is really the strategic link style approach of having to correctly traverse a course and do it from a thinking man's perspective. Troon doesn't necessarily make that straightforward. Like, we can get into all the nuanced factors with this. One of the complexities for me is that when players are going to have different ball flights from these holes, from hole to hole here, there's just this naturally exposed deep predisposition to the wind. Shots are going to come from one angle. You're going to have a different direction on the next thing. It's kind of like the blueprint on a lot of these link style courses that any time that you have a course by the water, random gusts can come into play. European tracks are a lot different. And when I built a model here, a lot of what I was trying to do is take away your very generic blueprint of how you're looking at these courses from a week in, week out perspective, and try to gear this to what Royal Troon is going to really accentuate for players this week. So there's a lot of that went into my model. We'll talk about it more of which of the players ended up getting highlighted for me, but it should be a really fun contest and a really interesting board from top to bottom here.
Just a note for our audience, there is rain and wind on the menu, at least from the projection over the weekends, but Scotland is one of those areas of the world where the weather can change on a dime. So it's important not to overreact necessarily to projections that are multiple days out, because depending on the tee times, it's going to impact different groups. So you don't want to, over lever yourself in that spot. All right. Welcome back to the pod, Pat. Iona Stevens did a wonderful hole-by-hole overview of this course on Golf Digest's YouTube channel, and she really stressed that this course is one to manage, picking and choosing your spots as opposed to trying to bend the course to your will. Spencer mentioning the deep and menacing bunkers throughout, pot bunkers all over this course. In regards to the top of the board, you look at Scotty Scheffler at 9-2, Rory at 8-1, Xander 11-1, Colin Morikawa at 16-1, as well as Ludwig Aberg at 16-1. From those 5, who do you think has the patience and risk aversion to be able to put together 4 splendid rounds and to win this thing?
Well, the way that you've laid that out, that would directly lead me to Xander and Ludwig, who are probably my 2 least favorite of players of this course. And I think that going into major championships, we just made this mistake at Pinehurst that we thought almost the same thing, like, oh, you can't hit into the wire grass and you're going to be screwed half the time. And then it just turns out you hit it in there. It's not a problem whatsoever. Not saying hit it into a gorse bush. Not saying that. But I do think that although Bryson may have said that you can't just bomb and gouge this place, you can, especially on the front 9. The first 8 holes are simple, and you can do a ton of scoring on those 8 holes. Even the burn down the middle of 3, the par 5, the majority of the field in 2016 laid up in front of that. Guys in the practice rounds were easily clearing that, leaving them about like 125 on a second shot into a par 5. So I think you're going to see distance play far more of a factor than we did a decade ago. Guys hit it farther, guys hit it straighter now, and the more of the field actually can do that. The only thing that would limit any of that is if you get the wrong wind. And right now, just looking at the hour by hour, we're still a day out or so from what it's going to be in Scotland, but gusts up to 25 miles per hour, not a ton of rain until the weekend. So it should be playing, I don't want to say firm and fast, but these courses generally do run firm and fast because they're so good at getting rid of the water. And there hasn't been any rain there the past 3 days. Not that it's scorching by any means, it's like 60 degrees. But I do think that the Bombers are going to have an advantage, at least early on, to set the pace if they can get the right sort of wind. Now, distance is also going to play a factor on the back nine. If the wind is in your face, then the guys with the fewest amount of 225-yard approaches into par 4s are going to be at a significant advantage in this spot. I think that when it comes to Open Championships, I think a lot of the time we really minimize how much distance can play a factor. But when we scroll back, it's funny that Cam Smith was the one who ended up winning, but you take a look at everyone else who was on that leaderboard. It's just guys that absolutely dummy the ball off the tee. You will need a bit more accuracy here, but I do think it can be somewhat of a cheat code, especially on the back nine, when you're going to have to listen. If guys can hit a 7-iron instead of hitting a hybrid or a 4-iron, it's going to be a big advantage. So I would be leaning towards your traditional link style players who have that experience with the changing elements of all time, because that can just mess with people's brains. But other than that, give me some distance.
Before we let Spencer take a crack at the top of the board, what are your thoughts on Scheffler still being priced, sub 5-1? Do you think that's still an overreaction and artificially enhancing the odds from a player's perspective to get better numbers on the challengers? Or do you think he is properly priced given how well he's played end to end this year?
It's a better number than we've been seeing on him. I mean, listen, he keeps winning at 3-1. I think that is overpriced. I don't think he walks into any tournament with a 33% chance to win. Like, it's overvalued for my taste, but it's actually quite fair based on what we've seen.
Spencer, do you agree?
I mean, Pat and I kind of broke this down at the US Open. Like, the 3-1 going rate when you had a really volatile course there put me in this position, and I know Pat agreed when we had the discussion, to where it just wasn't like a proper going rate where I actually wanted to get exposure to it. It's a little bit different here. 5-1 starts putting us into a little bit of a better range. The proximity number into these small greens, the total driving does give him a little bit of an ability to separate from the pack. But I guess for me, when we're talking about a mark like this that's 5-1 and you have a negative trajectory with the putter that I have inside of my sheet, I still don't believe we're getting a proper number. I mean, where we have it right now. Like, if you look at those negative trajectory marks on similar green complexes of what I'm talking about, if you want to take players that are sub 100-1 that get the wrong movement in their profile based off of it, it's Scotty, it's Spieth, it's Thomas, it's Homa, it's McIntyre, it's Oberg. The big difference is in Oberg, you can throw into this mix also. We could have this whole discussion with Oberg where the correct time to bet him last week was at 18-1. All of a sudden here, you get a 12-1 number. I think you're chasing the wrong end of the movement there. Scotty at 5-1 when there is this profile return that you're getting where it's the subpar scrambling that he has from outside the sand. I know Scotty's one of the best scramblers in the world, but he had the same problem when you put him in some of these uneven spots at the US Open. It's not a death sentence. It doesn't mean that he cannot win this contest, but when it takes such a large exposure to your card to actually get to Scotty, I'm not going to do it at 5-1. I'm going to let him beat me. And that's kind of my mentality that I have for most of these guys at the top. Like, for me, it's the one slight difference from what Pat said. And it's the same discussion that him and I had at the US Open. I mean, we could just roll this back into the conversation again. For me, it's Xander and Colin at the top that are the two most enticing. And where I ended up flipping the script a little bit is Colin opened at 18-1. You can still find him at 18-1 located out there at a couple books. I think Colin is the best bet on the board if you're looking to go up to the top of the slate here and you're trying to get exposure.
I would agree. And you can get him as deep as 20 at some spots. My issue with it is you have Hatton, who's still lingering at 28. And I don't see that much of a dissimilarity between Morikawa, the way that he's playing, and Hatton in the way he's playing. Yes, Morikawa has won an Open Championship, but these link style courses, what Hatton primarily beats up in his career.
A
I
question
agree
for you.
completely on that sentiment, by the way. Like, I started my card, and I don't know, Michael, if you want to move into the actual outright bets that we have this week or not.
Sure. I also would love to hear your methodology in terms of how do you balance momentum throughout the season, performance on similar links courses with bent grass greens, and just for perspective, the greens at Troon are among the smallest of the Open Championship, a quarter of the size of the greens at St. Andrews, and then also performances in majors specifically. You have players like Rory who can look at 7 top fives in the British Open, a win obviously in 2014 at Royal Liverpool. But how much does that play a part into your model, how you view someone in terms of their value, as opposed to how they're playing right at this moment?
I've been a big proponent of this as I've talked about it on shows in the past. I build my model from a longer term duration of time than most people. It's a 2-year running model. As we get further in the season, more of the statistics go towards this year. I think for me, though, when you go specifically to one of these major championships to where we don't have a ton of data for Royal Troon, we can talk about the trends that have been at this property in the past. Henrik kind of broke all of those. There'd been a bunch of American winners before he'd won. You talked about it, Michael, like 10 to 13 under is about what the winning rate was. He got it to 20. I think the real difference there, though, is Phil and Henrik ended up blitzing the place. If you go to the third place finisher, JB Holmes was 6 under. So I don't want to look too much into what that answer is, but I'm always trying to find a golfer whose long-term perspective is better than what the market is perceiving it. But when you look at a lot of these more nuanced factors that come into play, you talked about slow bent grass greens and small green complexes in general. And I don't disagree with what Pat has talked about with distance. I certainly think that you look at these first couple holes here, look at the short par fours, there's an ability to separate yourself from the pack. And for me, that's kind of a DFS answer to where a name like Bryson ends up becoming more enticing in that sort of outlook, just because I think the general population is going to look at this course. They're going to hear what's being said. They're going to build models and say, you have to be accurate to find success. And I do believe there's a lot that goes into that. But when leverage starts shifting in one direction or another, and we can have this Bryson conversation later, because I do have a matchup that's involving him that just goes in a different mentality with it. But yeah, there's, I guess, to answer your question, Michael, it's just, you look at this type of a venue, and it's always very important, in my opinion, would be my take on it, is not to go too much into what we've seen in the last 12 rounds, what we've seen the last go around with it. I'm always trying to build things a little bit broader than that answer.
And I do the exact opposite. I don't think that there's any better predictor of what's going to happen next than what just happened. Like recent form, recent trends, how guys are playing and trying to peak at the moment, I think is always step one when looking at it. Step two, especially when assessing a major championship, is basically performance in other majors. Like when the pressure gets dialed up, the courses get a little bit tougher. Like very rarely do you see someone who's never performed well in a major ever and they end up winning. Like Wyndham Clark is such an outlier in that regard, where most guys have at least a top 10 finish, usually a top 5 or top 3 finish in a major before they end up breaking through and winning. The Open is more susceptible to that because they generally play at shorter courses. You have these elements that come into play that are completely uncontrollable. And like, listen, accuracy is going to be important this week. But I think the thing that people get really caught up on is like, well, it has to be driving accuracy. Well, there's a really big difference between Colin Morikawa and Sung Jae Im, who can take driver off the tee and hit it as hard as they want, and it goes directly down the middle of the fairway. Well, what if Bryson just hit 7 iron off of every tee? Well, Phil was hitting 4 iron most of the time the last time that we played here. Like, yeah, Phil's not a very accurate driver of the ball. When a 4 iron is in his hand, it's a little bit different. So you have some of these guys that maybe you're writing off because they're not the most accurate players. That doesn't really mean anything here if they're not hitting driver.
Before we move past that point, Michael, so I think I really like what Pat just said to that, is off the tee for me is one of the things I built. I wanted off the tee at hard to hit fairways. There are a lot of players that are inaccurate players that if you just look at their broad sense of the answer there and you throw them onto a venue like this where they're clubbing down, where their numbers get a lot better in projected driving accuracy or projected off the tee data. The question I want to ask Pat is, and when we look at current form versus the long-term answer there, and I'd be curious to get your perspective, because for me, outright betting has a lot to do with current form. I think head-to-head betting, there's a lot more of a long-term answer that comes into play. Would you agree with that, at least with it?
For a 72-hole matchup, sure. I think you want to look at baseline. You want to look at similar courses and the players and obviously the price that people are being compared to. I can get behind that. On round-to-round betting, I think it's more like just what did they do last round? How have they done over their past 8 rounds, their past 12 rounds, and see how they're actually guiding in one direction. But I mean, listen, I'll wait till the NFL to coin flip and bet some money. I'm not too concerned about head-to-heads.
All right, if you guys had to both offer up 1 to 2 golfers in that top 15 in terms of the shortest odds on the board to begin building your card for our audience, where do you start? And I'll start with you, Pat. I know that you crossed a few golfers off the list right away, so I'm interested to see who you pull here at Royal Troon.
Yeah, and if all things being equal and they were all the same odds, then I would have a different answer to that question and wouldn't be crossing guys off from the top of the board. But I'm betting Tony Finau because I'm a loser who likes to lose money, and anyone who bets on Tony Finau knows that. But no better player in the wind over the last 3 years. He's basically putting together a Scotty Scheffler light season, except the putter hasn't really flipped until the last month or so. The ball striking has been immaculate for him so far this year. He couldn't chip for 5 months. He's gained 6 in a row. Couldn't putt, like actively putted himself out of tournaments for about 5 months. He's gained in his past 3. What has happened? 2 of which being signature events, one of them being the US Open. Now he has 3 straight top 10 finishes. So he's played really well at the Open before. He was actually top 20 in his Open debut at Troon about 8 years ago now. And he's missed the cut once in 7 years. That was in 7 times. That was last time. He has a top 30 finish in all of them. Like, he's very comfortable with these surfaces. And I think when you say bent grass, people get thrown off a little bit because you can put it, like, you can go to Fantasy National right now, put it in the bent grass solution, see who putts the best on bent grass. But trying to think that the bent grass greens at Augusta have any correlation with the greens here is just crazy.
What are your thoughts here, Spencer, in terms of top golfers that you would like to target now? And also, just for perspective for our audience, how much of your weekly allotment in terms of how many units you want to have in play do you keep on the sideline to play after round 1, after the cut on Friday? How do you go ahead and play some of those live numbers or after the rounds are finished?
I don't necessarily have a set number. I would say the generic blueprint of what I'm looking for in the outright market is I'm betting to win between 7 to 10 units. I'm trying not to have more than a unit at risk. Where value comes into play, I will go larger or shorter on that number. I'm never, taking that cookie cutter answer of saying I must get to 1 unit of exposure. I must bet to win 8 units. I will figure out where my edges are. Where do I have the largest deviations in my model and go from there. I'm somebody that does find myself in the head-to-head market. Like, that is my bread and butter space that I'm trying to be in. Volatile bets are going to be these outright tickets. Do think these placement markets have a lot of in the middle ground there. And the only reason why I give that answer, not saying that it's better than what you would expect it to be, I do think books have been very tight in that market. That just means that there's a higher hold percentage at the end of the day, and high hold percentages end up yielding a lower ROI expectation. So when I went to the top of the board here and I gave all those answers, and I was really aggressive at the top. I went with Morikawa. I talked about this being Xander versus Morikawa for me. The big difference, and when we look at that short-term data that Pat was talking about, I took every result and every statistic since Xander's PGA win. That was what I was trying to figure out, how to differentiate Xander versus Morikawa. The long-term data is going to push me in the direction of Xander. The short-term data was kind of quite heavily in the favor of Morikawa. Xander's been outgained off the tee when you compare the two since that moment of his victory. Off the tee, that is 0.55 strokes per week for Xander, 2.34 for Morikawa. You're going to get an iron play answer where Xander got aided at the US Open, 7.1 shots he gained there. 3.02 shots per event is what he's gained. Morikawa's 3.22. And then the biggest factor is the one for me that's pushing me in the direction of Morikawa is, and I've always said this, when you can take a golfer that is a premier ball striker and their bread and butter is not going to be their short game, but they're achieving over their baseline in that area, that's usually when a victory ends up happening, when you can merge that ball striking with the actual recent results that we've gotten with the short game. So Morikawa, 1.54 per event since that PGA championship around the green, 2.72 with the putter. I just think there are so many high-end marks that Morikawa is checking the box for right now that it made him my favorite play at the top of the board. And then The reason why I didn't have room for Xander on my card goes back to this answer of a lack of public perception, which is, I think, what Colin's having right now because he's not getting across the finish line. And you look at Tommy Fleetwood at 25-1, and Pat has already mentioned this, Tyrrell Hatton at 28-1. I've said this numerous times for these two in Europe, but what you think their win equity in America doesn't necessarily 100% hold true during some of these link-style European courses. Both graded as top 10 projected Open Championship players for me long-term. Each landed as a top 10 player on similar courses when you run comp projections. And then the biggest factor of what I keep going back to with all these answers is where I landed in my perception versus what the perception is of both the market and the casual bettor. I get the general disdain that people are going to have. You hear Tommy Fleetwood 25-1, he's never won on the PGA Tour. You hear Tyrrell Hatton at 28-1, you might think in the back of your mind that this is a reduced number, but my model had each one of those options as bet-worthy returns because of this higher than projected upside answer that my model seems to be spitting out versus that public narrative that I'm talking about, to where you don't have to look any further, Michael, where there's a lot of spots, and some of these are better or worse than others that we could talk about. But when you get these spots where in the mind of the public, a number is too short, but the sports books are skewing a price that is lower than the public perception. And you hear Hatton at 28-1 and you go, I am just out because this is a 50-1 sort of golfer. It's why it's so important for me, and why when I run my numbers, I always do a course specific outlook. Pat talked about this. I don't care how somebody has played on your prototypical bent grass greens. I don't care how somebody has played in a context that doesn't fit this week's venue. I always want to find the answer of what is the blueprint to find success here, and who are those golfers that have a higher win equity probability than the market is projecting. So I went very heavy with the Morikawa Fleetwood Hatton route. I don't normally have three players sub 30-1. That opens a card for me, but I thought all three of those names were just lower in the mind of the public and much higher in my model with their actual win equity.
Now, you teased it in that answer that you believe, at least according to your model, there's more about value, there's less volatility in these head-to-heads, and that market is kind of where you want to attack. What were two top ones that you absolutely couldn't wait to place a bet on as soon as the market came live?
So I always talk on these shows. I try to avoid these star versus star battles. You lose most of your miscut equity that comes into play. The one thing I've been talking about over on Links and Locks the past month is I've noticed this correction from books where they're much more aware of who the fade candidates are before the week begins. We keep seeing them place those options against one another on the odds board. They're also placing them against players where the juice is just far too heavy on the other end. I've talked about how you lose your implied probability by going towards the top of the board in these battles. I understand everything that Pat has talked about with distance here. And I kind of alluded to this previously with Bryson DeChambeau. There is a recipe for success with him where he can find it early in these rounds. I ended up betting Colin Morikawa over him at -120. Is he overvalued because of his hot start in the major? Sure. Is he probably going a little underrated by others because of everyone talking about the need to find the short grass off the tee? That's probably a yes also. Like, both of those two things can merge into the same world at the same time. But it's one of those situations for me where I felt like he can be an okay fit for the track, but still want to fade him when we dive into this boost that he's receiving from others that have pushed him into this range where he's a top 2 or 3 win equity candidate on the board. I went through and I looked at the first 3 majors of the year. We all know DeChambeau's biggest weapon. I mean, there's a lot of weapons he has, but the biggest weapon he has is going to be that driver. It's going to be the projected total driving. He doesn't get a return in my model that is so worrisome that I think he's going to miss the cut. I actually tend to think that he's going to be better here than a lot of the low-end people are going to project here. But this was a top 5 projected total driver for me that moved outside of the top 20 in my model with the way that I built it. So, I'm going to take who I keep saying is my favorite safe target on the board, who I think still has upside in Morikawa. And I'm going to try to outlast that more volatile nature of DeChambeau that he's bringing into this matchup. Where DeChambeau starts to make sense for me, where I'm not telling people to completely write him off, would be for DFS. if the mentality starts coming into play that you have to find the short grass, he's going to be sub 10% owned, and because they don't believe he's going to find the short grass, if there's a leverage that can get created, that's a different discussion to be had. But for me in matchups, I really don't care like what your actual upside is. I'm always looking what your floor projection is going to be. And Morikawa's floor projection is where at that minus 120 price, it just far surpasses what I'm getting from DeChambeau, even if the upside numbers are much closer.
Two questions for you, Pat. First, are you playing DeChambeau in any market? And secondly, what are some of the top head-to-heads that you've circled?
Yeah, I didn't circle any head-to-heads. Like I said, I'm not too concerned about that market. If I'm going to play a head-to-head, I'm likely going to play a 3-ball or a 2-ball in tournament once I actually have some data to work off of. I find that is more my sweet spot when it comes to it, unless I scroll through and I see something that is way off. Like, for example, this actually might be a bad example, but you can get Brooks plus 110 against Bobby Mack this week, and it's crazy to think about how Robert McIntyre could be a minus 125 favorite over Brooks Koepka in a major. If there was ever going to be a time where that would happen, I think we're at like the very center of that tornado right now, coming off a win, still in Scotland, Brooks playing bad golf. But I think I would still take Brooks at plus money against Bobby Mack in a full tournament matchup, just based on the long-term viability of Brooks Koepka and how good that he's been at major championships. Even the Open Championship, he's been really good. But that's not really what I'm looking at. For Bryson, I will most definitely be playing him on DFS. I'm not going to bet him to win because the price is too short. And I'm kind of with Spencer on this, that if I'm going to get up there, it probably is going to be Morikawa, because it all depends on the conditions. Like you mentioned, good conditions when Stenson set the record last time. It's not actually true. They were horrendous conditions. Phil, Stenson, JB Holmes, Beef Johnson, Charles Schwartzel. At the Open, there's no split tees. So everyone tees off of one. So there's like 10 hours worth of golfers teeing off on the first tee throughout the course of the day. So the conditions the first 10 groups might play in has nothing in common with how the last 10 play in. And even little microwaves in between, that they all got sandwiched in this one spot of the draw where the conditions were just optimal for them. Everyone else's conditions were horrible. That's how you see two guys that are over 12 shots better than the rest of the field. Like only 11 guys finish under par that entire year. So it all depends on that kind of thing. And with Bryson, there's volatility. He's going to pick a strategy and he's going to go with it. The problem with Bryson, as Spencer alluded to, is that there's a lot of volatility. When it's going right for Bryson, it's going to go really right. When it goes wrong, he's not the best at making in-round adjustments. Like he has his game plan. If it's not working, he kind of doesn't know what to do at that point. So far, his strategy has been on point in 2023, especially in the majors. That's very clear based on his results. But this is a tournament where, with the weather, with a bad lie, a bad break off one of these hills, and it rolls into whatever, and you have a terrible lie in there, that I could see that getting to Bryson. So I get why playing him in a head-to-head matchup against him makes sense, because he feels far more likely to miss the cut or come T50 than Morikawa does, because Morikawa is probably going to be like, I don't know, T15 at worst, it seems. And like, I mean, if you bet him to win, you hope it's winning, but like he's probably a better lock to come inside the top 5 than Bryson, although Bryson probably, if he picks right, has a better chance to win, if that makes any sense.
Well, just off of that, you talk about the stability of some of these top golfers and the tiers within those stability rankings. Let's talk long shots for a second. Somebody who could come out of the woodwork and really put a scare into people on Sunday with a huge number attached to them. Were there any that you feel were truly mispriced, or is it more so, throwing a couple darts and hoping that you have multiple golfers come the weekend, some with long numbers, let's say north of 50 to 1?
Yeah, I think that's the most viable strategy. I think that everyone glommed on to the same guy because his number is no longer super long. I bet Louis at 110 to 1 with 8 placement points to go along with it. Like, people don't pay attention to live, which has made a lot of the live guys kind of very valuable in this field. Like the live guys that Bryson and Brooks, like, about them. What has everyone else been doing? No one's really paying attention to that. Louis been awesome on live. He hasn't played in a major so far this season. He won 2 events on the DP World Tour in January and December to finish out his season. He came second in Oman as well on an Asian Tour event with most of the live guys in it. He has 3 seconds on live so far this year. He's an Open Championship winner. He's won the Alfred Dunhill Links before as a rotation tournament through Scotland at the same time. He's been bet down to 65 to 1. I'm sure we've all been on it. Even at 65 to 1, it gives me some pause because now he's in the range of like real guys that you could see winning. But I just think that people are still kind of underrating how good his game is both for this course and how good it's been this year. And then the other one that's way deeper down the board, depending on where you want to bet him right now, I bet him as a future at 150 to 1 about 3 weeks ago when I thought that he was going to win in Detroit. I actually think that Akshay is kind of great for links golf, and I think that he's kind of great for this course. Like if you're looking at a Stenson prototype, Bhattia's kind of it. He's not super long off the tee, but he's wildly accurate. His irons are amazing. His short game is an absolute travesty, but that's not why you're betting him. If Stenson had been missing greens in regulation at Troon in 2016, he would have shot plus 80 because the guy can't chip to save his life. He just hit everything to 30 feet and putts started to drop for him. That was his entire game all week. Then he hit some close and made all of them. Bhattia's game is very similar. And if he can putt from off the green or not find himself in a world of trouble, he's been very good in the wind, keeps the ball in play, and he can get scorching hot with his irons that he's probably unlikely to win, hence why he's 150 to 1. But I actually think he should be priced much higher than that.
It's going to be difficult to have any long shot more enticing than Louis at 110. Talk about a pairing of a golfer and a number that really entices me. But Spencer, is there anybody in that neighborhood that jumped off the page to you?
I said this on Monday in one of my articles. I think when the odds board opened initially, your best and worst values were probably these live golfers. Like I've kind of made my argument why I think certain players are volatile. Louis would be the best of that answer when that number opened. He shouldn't have been in the hundreds, and we've seen the market correct itself from everything that he's provided over the last couple months. The live golfer that I decided to go to, and you can shop around and actually find even a little bit better than what I grabbed here. I ended up taking Cameron Smith at 50 to 1. Smith was a golfer that I heavily faded at the US Open in matchups throughout the week. I had this poor expected off the tee play that my model ended up generating. I realize we don't necessarily get the most ideal outcome here at Royal Troon either, but it's not as if Cameron Smith hasn't gone to some of these, look at the Players Championship. He takes down the Players Championship at a course that I wouldn't have necessarily thought from a driving answer is the best course for him either there. But you look at where he was in my model at the last major at the US Open, 129th for projected total driving. He jumps into the top 75 here. I know that these are very still low end marks that we're talking about, but you add that to the top 15 projected scorer grade that he had for me. You get the number one output from a short game expectation when you combine around the green putting and scrambling into one category. I think whether we're talking DFS or betting, this was a really nice buy low spot for him after what many in the public are deeming to be a disappointing start to the season. So I grabbed him at 50. I'm going to play him also for DFS. And then the one true long shot that I took, I guess my one concern is once we start entering this 135 or higher range, there's an argument to be made that one, depending on how you build your card, you might not have room for these options. And two, we might be pushing this a little bit further back than we should be, where all of a sudden these names start becoming better top 5, top 10, top 20 sort of bets. I ended up taking Alex Noren at 135 to 1. If you listen to me on any Action Network show, you will know that this is my shit show special that I do every single major, that he finds his way onto my card, and it hasn't necessarily worked out in the past. I understand that, but this is that high ceiling, low floor sort of outcome that my model was projecting. I thought his late addition into the field after he qualified through the Genesis Scottish Open got us a softer price in various iterations of the market than we would have gotten if he had already been qualified prior to last week. And then really the one caveat that pushed me in this direction is my model didn't rank Noren worse than 23rd for any of the 6 main categories that I ran, which included a comp course answer of 6th overall and a scrambling return of 4th when you combine overall scrambling with the player's ability to scramble from out of the sand. As I said, I think we're starting to push it in this range, but, I like the Bhatia call. I think he's certainly viable. I think Noren is viable for all the reasons I talked about. There's a handful of other players. I'm going to be very scarcely making these wagers. I'd rather push them towards top 5s or top 10s.
Good number on Noren. The best I'm seeing in market right now is 90s. That's nice to jump on that. The other guy that I was kind of thinking about from I feel like the tournament has to go a certain way for Bhatia to have a chance. Now, he was top 20 at the US Open. He has top 10s in the 2 events after that, a 5th at the Travelers, a 2nd in Detroit. So he's playing good golf coming in. And now he has some of this major experience. You never know how guys are going to play on links golf when you've never seen that happen before. But there's just a couple of really boring names from down the list that it's not so much that their odds seem long. It's that I think that they're better than a lot of the players who were in front of them. Like, for example, I love Aaron Rai. I bet Aaron Rai like every single week. The fact that he's the same as like Wyndham Clark and Cam Young and Sung Jae in this tournament, like, no. And even those guys at 65-1 seem off. But like, why is Russell Henley 120-1?
Yeah, I mean, I agree. I think if you look at any of the accuracy numbers that I keep talking about, and if you look at the sand play that he's projected to perform, like, for me, he's a top 20 expected win equity candidate. And I guess the answer I would give to this, Pat, is what I have kind of said this entire time about every single golfer that I keep finding myself on. The public perception of Russell Henley's lack of win equity pushed him too far on the odds board when everything opened up to start the week, in my opinion.
And it happens. Like, we've seen this with a couple players so far this year that, I mean, Henley's only playing majors and signature events. He's only playing in the strongest fields. We're not getting him at the John Deere and the Wyndham anymore. And he's still piling up great results in these tournaments. The other one I would just take a look at for pure skills would either be Harris English at 200-1, who kind of fits that same mold, but Abraham Answer at 200-1. Like, he's basically Corey Connors, but can putt sometimes. He's on live, so no one cares.
Yeah.
All right, one last question for you guys, because this course has been described as Dante-esque in that there's heaven, there's purgatory, and there's hell, almost broken up perfectly in 6-hole increments. You could argue that the 11th hole railway, if the wind is blowing across the fairway, can be very difficult, and that can be the jumping off point to that hellish finish. So I asked the question in this way. Colin Wilson and I were covering the College World Series on the Diamonds, and we talked about the ideal team to get ahead, that their bullpen was going to blow it, and you wanted to jump in from a live number. Who's a top 20, 30 golfer in this field that if they're up by 2 on Sunday, you're going to load up with some options behind them at, solid value on the board because you think this course will get the best of them down the stretch on Sunday?
Fleetwood.
Do you agree, Spencer?
Well, I mean, it's hard to argue that with what we've seen from Fleetwood historically in these opportunities. For me, it would probably be Bryson. I agree about all the upside answers. It's not going to shock me if Bryson puts it together. I do worry about how Bryson ends up closing here, though, with some of these holes.
Conversely, I mean, if Justin Thomas is like 4 off the lead or 5 off the lead going into Sunday, just bet him at whatever ridiculous odds that you get, because he'll shoot 62 while everyone else is 74 somehow.
All right, this has been the Action Network podcast presented by BetMGM. For Spencer Aguiar and Patrick Mayo, I'm Mike Calabrese. Thank you so much for listening to our British Open preview. If you are jonesing for more action, go on over to the Action Network app. We have you covered top to bottom with all kinds of exotic outrights, head-to-heads, lots of action coming in. And as we mentioned, it's always important to shop around. These numbers can differentiate between books. You want to make sure you get the absolute best before the first tee off on Thursday. All right, that's it for us. Thanks so much for listening, and have a good one.